on Thursday to a seminar in HSS. And I think I have a wonderful privilege today to introduce Professor Catherine Gomes to HSS, in which she'll introduce the wonderful topic of digital media diversity in the physical world, transient migrant experience. You've probably already seen her CV, so I won't actually read her CV to you, but perhaps by way of introduction of how I came to know Kat and why I invited her to come to Singapore and give us a talk. My name is Ming Swan Chow. I'm in the Public Policy and Global Affairs program here at NHSS. And a couple of years ago, I was very curious about the study of migration and also the impact in Singapore. So I started to look up literature on this topic. And I came across the wonderful work by Kat. And from that point onwards, I actually just emailed to her and we started discussing various topics. And I found that there's a lot of synergy, and it's great to have you here with us today. And she did a talk yesterday at NIE, and hopefully in your talk today, maybe you can liaise some of the discussion points that were raised yesterday. Okay? So Kat will probably speak for about half an hour to 40 minutes, or no more, so that we can have more of a conversation afterwards. Okay? Great, Kat.
Oh, thank you, Swan. That was actually very nice. She's made my day. This means I have to buy her dinner tonight. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you for having me as well. Today I'm going to talk about, as the title actually tells us, digital media and diversity. And I'll give you a little bit of background about why I'm doing this. This is the result of about 6 years of work. I've been actually working across, 3 projects for the last few years. And my expertise basically is on transient migration. And when I study migration, I actually look also at both digital and physical worlds. And in a lot of my work, I actually talk about how we actually cannot separate looking at mobility and migration separately from the digital, the digital and the physical should not be separately actually looked at. So I've been actually working on three projects the last few years, and this talk is actually based on one of the chapters of a recently released book which came out about a month ago. And in particular, my work actually looks also a lot at international students. I was an international student back in the day, and so as an academic, right, you sometimes deal with your own identities by through your own research work. All right. Why transient migrants and why transient migration? In literature on mobility and migration, whenever we talk about, say, international students or foreign talent, we always use this broad term called temporary, right? Temporary migration or temporary mobility. For me, I find that quite problematic because I think temporary creates this image or this concept of you go somewhere and then you disappear out. But for me, I feel that using the word transient or transient migrations, transient migrant is much more richer because you can actually see nuances. So for me, using this term temporary migrations, transient migrations basically means that we make decisions, we go to a place, and then sometimes we may decide, should we stay there or should we not? I study a lot of international students in Australia, and for many of them, they come to Australia, they study there, and then after about a year or two, they fall in love with the place, right? And then they decide, oh, I want to stay. So they go through sort of like different ways on staying. And then sometimes, people take up permanent residency, and then what they do then is they decide, oh, maybe I don't want to stay here forever, maybe I want to go somewhere. So it's kind of like transient, or sometimes they may come back. Like even my sort of like journey has been such where I did my undergraduate in Australia, in Western Australia, in Perth, and then I went back. I'm actually Singaporean, so I came back to Singapore. And I went back to Australia, but Melbourne this time, as an international student as well. And so again, that is also transient for me. It's a kind of boomerang up and down, not just between Singapore, but also with Australia. So that's why I use that term. So, oh, hello. The computer's deciding that it doesn't quite agree with me. So which is good, dissent is actually a good thing. So, that's what I basically do. So for me, as the slide says, some transnational transient migrants may not want to prolong their overseas experience in the receiver country, while others may want to settle more long-term as permanent residents or even citizens. Transient migrants thus are transient within the temporary migrant space as they move and upgrade their visa statuses and conditions. In other words, while temporary implies a direct and opposing situation to permanence, transience is not so limited and instead allows for mobility within the term itself. And these days, whenever we also think about sort of like permanent residence, permanent residence is not permanent anymore. Permanent residence is not about settlement. It's about opportunities. So, say if I'm a permanent resident of Australia, but then if a job comes about, say in the US, I will actually, if it's a good job, give me a sort of like professorship, I will go, right? But at the same time, I may still hold on to my permanent residency. But that doesn't mean that I will come back. And if I come back, it doesn't mean that I'll settle there forever as well. So, this term is now very problematic. And I think as scholars, we need to question these terms because mobility and migration is really not what it was even 15, 20 years ago, and which I think is such a dynamic, exciting space. So, like I showed you just now, these are the 3 projects in the last few years I've been conducting. I started off, I think about 2011, in the first project where I was interviewing international students in Australia in focus groups. And some of the data that I'll be talking about today comes from there. My huge project was between 2013 to 2016, where I was fortunate enough to get an Australian Research Council grant, where it allowed me to just talk to a lot of people. So I just talked to a lot of people, really a lot. I interviewed over 200 people, both in Singapore and Australia, by myself, thank you. So and doing work like that is always so exciting because you talk to people, you learn their stories, and you go back home, it's so fresh in your mind, you start writing and you see patterns coming out, and it's just so exciting. And the final project, which is a project I'm actually really proud of in terms of the number of people who actually responded. It was a project where we were looking at it was an online survey, and we wanted to understand where people or international students in Australia get their information from. And we had close to 7,000 respondents, and that's a paper by itself, because when I was actually looking at Qualtrics, so we use Qualtrics, and I panicked because I thought someone had actually infiltrated our survey, because every hour I checked, respondents went up by a good 1,000. So you panic. I called my husband, who's in IT, and was like, help, I think someone sort of like infiltrated our survey. But what basically happened is my research partner sent our survey to, this is Australia, yeah? He sent our survey to a health provider. The health provider sent out the survey to their customers, to their clients, yeah? And this is why we had so many hits. And for us, what we read this as that international students listen to their health providers, their health service providers, because to them it was the health providers know what, have their best interests at heart. So if they tell me, oh, do the survey, I will do it. And, again, that's sort of like a paper by itself. Okay. So what sort of I like to do is I like to actually understand about diversity. And for me, to understand diversity, we need to also pay attention to the migrant digital experiences. I mean, many of you are probably familiar with Daniel Miller's work, yeah, in the space. Like his very exciting project called While We Post, critiques past academic studies which look at digital platforms as separate entities. Daniel Miller's, if you get a chance, look at Daniel Miller's While We Post. He had a sort of like 5-year project, I think. And what he did was he employed a whole bunch of postdocs. And it was a 15-month project, that's right. And he employed all these postdocs, and he put these postdocs in different places in Europe and other places as well. And what he did was he made them stay there. It was an anthropological project, and to understand about how people use digital media. So if you're interested, the results of which are actually available on the website for while we post. But better still, every year there has been a book or a couple of books coming out from this particular project published by UCL, and it's free for downloading. You know, so you actually get to see, and this is probably one of the most phenomenal projects I've seen in very recent projects that actually looks at the digital space and how that digital space connects with the real world or the physical world. So if you get a chance, check out why we post. Now, for me, when I was sort of like looking at transient migrants, I also wanted to find out how they actually adapt to life overseas. And for my, in the second project, the one where I talked to a lot of people, this is what they basically told me. So they've actually got a few different ways and really creative ways which they combine in order to actually create a space for themselves to make meaning, while they're in transient. So they do things, communicate with the sender nation. So that means the home nation, yeah. So they'll connect with friends and family. They send digital photographs to friends and family. Which is common sense, right? At the same time, what I was finding is that because social media is so much part of everyday life, every time we're always sort of like checking this, right? Watching TV, we're checking this. Halfway in between dinner, we're checking this. And so what they were telling me is that a way for them to actually connect back to the home country and or the center country, and to me this was fascinating, was they won't communicate with their social media contacts. What they'll do is they'll stalk them. Think about it, right? So you are actually on Facebook. What you're doing is you're actually looking at your friends' posts and your friends' photographs. You're not engaging in terms of sort of like saying, oh, this is a lovely photograph, or talking to them. What you're doing is like, okay, so you're scrolling. And you're going, oh, so this is what this person is doing. So you're actually, in a way, it's surveillance, but then it's an open surveillance. And so when I was talking to my respondents, they were like, yeah, we're stalking our friends. But that was also quite interesting, because doing that, they were actually understanding about what was going on back in the home nation. In 2015, when Lee Kuan Yew passed away, I actually didn't find out about that until someone actually started posting in Facebook. Now, 5 months before that, people were still posting stuff like that. So what do? You then check sort of like CNN, the Straits Times, to actually verify. So you're actually getting information, in this kind of like passive kind of way, and again, sort of like quite interesting. So of course, reminders of the home nation, the center nation. What they used to do online was do things like make general searches for information on people. Like what I did. They'll actually shop online. From sort of like places countries that they come from. Think of the Chinese students. So the Chinese students will actually be going to Chinese online shopping platforms in order to actually buy stuff. They search online in the languages that they are used to. They watch, read, listen to online news. Watch online films, watch television shows from their home region, and so on. And that by itself is quite interesting. A lot of media studies work. When we talk about like migrants, we always talk about how productions from the home country is very important. So things like people from Hong Kong will reconnect back to Hong Kong through all the Hong Kong shows. A lot of work about the Hong Kong diaspora in the 1980s and 90s discussed about this. But then when I spoke to my respondents, what they tell me is that when it comes to films or television that they're used to, it's not stuff that's made in Hong Kong or India or wherever. It's actually stuff made from the US, because the Americans are the biggest distributor of films, of television, and so for them to feel a sense of home, they actually watch American stuff. So interesting enough, in Australia, many of the transient migrants I spoke to love The Big Bang Theory. So they all watch that. In Singapore, the international students and the foreign talent watch Suits, as like Meghan Markle's Suits. And so when I asked them why, and they said, oh, it's because it teaches us how to actually behave in the financial, in financial institutions, because I want to be in the financial institutions. I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. That's also, again, another paper for another time. So, you know, and for me, what I was reading is sort of that media, yeah, in whatever way, shape, or form, plays a very important part in having the sense of belonging, creating the sense of belonging. And of course, friendships and associations, you know, made up of co-nationals. And it'll be things like playing online games. So, like, if you go to Melbourne, where I am, and if you go to sort of like, okay, Melbourne is shaped in such a way, the CBD is actually really small, but the CBD is also gated by a number of institutions. University institutions like my university, RMIT, Melbourne University, Victoria University, as well as other kinds of, you know, interstate offshore providers, like Central Queensland University, which apparently is in other places outside of Central Queensland, which is interesting by itself. And so if you go into like internet cafes, and they still exist, you find that they're all filled with students playing online games. So the online games actually create this sense of belonging, because who they'll be pairing up with the online games, all these, you know, RPGs, is with people from their home countries. So, and they'll be speaking in whatever languages that they're used to, right? So Chinese students will be speaking in Mandarin, you know, and they're playing with each other, you know, and they're playing, you know, as a team against other sort of like teams, whether or not they're Chinese or not. So again, sort of like, you know, these are sort of like really quite interesting things where you've got this kind of virtual connection to the home nation, you know, through mundane activities such as playing games. So the significance of the digital world. This is one of my, I love pictures like this, right? Because this is what you see in an MRT in Singapore. This is what you see in a train in Hong Kong. This is what you see in a train in Australia. You know, this can be anywhere, yeah? And this is sort of like, you know, has always been a very powerful image for me. And you know, that was actually, it comes from a book that I edited a couple of years ago, where, you know, if you look at this image, or if you're going back in the train today, everyone is looking at their phones, because that phone, strangely enough, keeps you connected to the various things you choose to be connected with, but it keeps you also disconnected from literally the physical presence of the person sitting next to you or in front of you. So the digital disrupts the physical environment, you know, so connections and disconnections now become sort of like, you know, those terms actually are shifted when we actually look at how the digital world has infected and affected the way that we negotiate our social relations with each other, as well as this, you know, the physical environment as well. Now, this is one of my favorite things ever. I think that the digital environment has also, you know, created different kinds of or layers when we talk about socio-economic conditions. Now think about it, right? You know, all of us have been overseas at one stage or the other. And what do we do overseas? When we come to an exotic place, that's called an exotic place Paris, because it is exotic. You know, when you're in Singapore, that is exotic. And so what do? We come down from the airport, and then we text, you know, on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. You know, we do this, you know, in front of this sign that says, "You're welcome to Paris" in French. It may be saying something else in French, but we just go, "Oh, it's in French, so therefore." And so what we're doing is that we're telling the world, look, we are now in France. You know, I just got into a plane, and I came to France when, you know, about 20 hours ago, I was in Singapore. And then, you know, what we do is we take more photographs of ourselves in France, and then maybe after that we'll go to Helsinki and we take more photographs of ourselves in Helsinki. Now, what is that doing? We're taking photographs and then we're broadcasting on social media. And when we're doing that, we're doing two things. One is we are archiving our experiences, and archiving experiences where, you know, think of it sort of like this way. You know, my mother's generation, my parents' generation, in order to show your wealth, what do? You wear a lot of bling. You invite people to your house. and you show them the travels that you've been to, because what you have is all these sort of like souvenirs, and expensive souvenirs, like a wooden elephant from Thailand as part of your mise en scène in your house. Now you don't have to do that. All you need to do is take photographs of yourself, Instagram it, and then put on social media and then broadcast. So you're not just archiving your travels very cheaply because you're doing this sort of like online, but you're also broadening out. You're telling everyone, see, I'm doing all this. I don't have to host you. You just look at what I'm doing. So what you're doing here is you're actually telling people that my experiences show you that I'm actually better than you in terms of socioeconomic conditions, because I'm going to all these exotic places. I'm having fun. What are you doing? You're stuck in a boardroom listening to Cat Gomes. Meanwhile, I'm in France, or I'm in a nice warm place, with a nice cute guy or girl enjoying the beach. So again, you've got sort of like these kind of really interesting activities happening, which actually then question the way that we do things like collect things, material culture. It questions the way that we archive things. It also questions the way that we actually show or perform our wealth. So think about it in those terms. All right. So transient migrants and the digital experiences. Now, I interviewed 201 people, right? But the best quote I ever had is this: "Home is where the Wi-Fi is." It was from a chap who was 26. He was Indonesian, and he had gone to Raffles Institution, RGC, and then did engineering at NUS. And he had also traveled a lot, where when he was younger, his parents are also academics, so he had gone to Malaysia. He lived in the US for a while, and for him, what he was saying is that home is really very much where the Wi-Fi is. So he can always connect to his parents, to his siblings, whenever there is Wi-Fi. So that for me was one of the best quotes I've ever heard, and something that I think tells us about how the term home itself is quite it's very different. It's very different even to what we think home is 10 years ago. So what do transient migrants view online? Like I said, they look a lot at American media, they look at news, they look at entertainment. One of the things that I'm very interested in is information seeking. Part of the things that I do in Australia is I do projects that also advise the Australian government in how to communicate with international students. I was saying this one, I was very lucky on Monday, I just got a small grant from the Victorian government to look at the way international students react to critical incidences. Because for international students in Australia, whenever a critical incident happens, what they do is they respond to that the way that they would respond if they were back home. A very small example is this. Now, in Australia, emergency services, the police, right, the number is 000. Now, a Singaporean student who's living in Australia, if they were to call sort of like, the emergency services, they won't call 000, they'll call 999, because that's what they were used to. So until something bad happens, you touch wood, they will refer to the things that they are used to. And this is where sort of like we need to question even notions of that digital native, and we need to also, when we question this idea of digital native, and I'll talk about this shortly after the slide, is that the way that a person uses digital media in one country does not necessarily mean they use it somewhere else. And likewise, the way that they react to certain things, in one country is very different to what that country expects of them. And then this is where we use digital media in order to bridge that divide. And in Daniel Miller's work, Miller and Midana, I think I pronounced the name properly, they wrote this exceptional book in 2012, and which I think many of us are familiar with, where they were using the term polymedia. So what they explain is that polymedia, and they were looking at actually Filipino migrants. They explain polymedia as we don't just use one kind of media, we use different kinds of media, yeah? So in terms of platforms, I've got my phone here, I've got a laptop here. In terms of social media, what do I have? I have LinkedIn, I have Instagram, I have Twitter, I have Facebook, so that's polymedia. However, in my work, I kind of pushed it one step further. I explained that yes, it's not just, it's polymedia, yes, but it's also polylingual media. Now think of it this way, where look at Chinese students, because Chinese students are probably the most interesting example that I can think of at the moment, where they come from China, where of course you know Google and many of the more common social media platforms are blocked. So what do? They have WeChat and so on. And what they do is that when they go overseas, they'll still be connecting with the Chinese social media. However, and so what they do also is that, you know, once they start going overseas, say as international students for like, say 2-3 years, what they do then is they then adopt other kinds of social media platforms like Facebook, because like places like Australia, social media is actually part of the pedagogy. So like in classrooms, universities actually encourage students to actually use things like Facebook in order to connect with each other. So as you know, if you're doing group work, so how do we communicate with each other? We use, say, Facebook, you know, or sometimes there are courses where, you know, you can actually Twitter, I don't know how it works, but you actually Twitter your assignments, yeah. And so basically what the Chinese students in this case are doing is that they are using Weibo, they're using Facebook, where polymedia, but also polylingual media, because in different languages, you know. And again, sort of like, you know, and this is where I think, you know, anyone who travels is able to adapt so well. Now, what about sort of like, you know, coming back to something I flagged earlier on, this idea of balancing different media products or different social media platforms. Some of the work that I've been doing, which resulted in a colleague of mine in Melbourne Uni and myself actually coming up with this term called digital journeys. So very briefly, what we basically talk about is, we talk about in particular international students, and we argue that international students, when they make the journey, the physical journey from whatever home country or sender country they come from, they don't just make a physical journey, but they also make a digital journey. So in Australia, there are a lot of programs for international students based on their physical journey. So those programs will be, okay, how we can help you with accommodation, how we can help you with you know, better study tactics, how we can help you adjust to, you know, your new environment. However, we always forget about the digital environment. Remember earlier I was saying that, you know, we always throw this term around, digital natives. But digital natives are natives of that particular place. Likewise, for digital media as well, or social media as well. So, for example, you know, Chinese students are the most obvious. You know, they're using Weibo, Chinese social media in China, and then they cross over to another country. What happens? They have to adapt and learn, right? New social media platforms and how to use them as used by the people in that country. However, the same goes for even social media platforms commonly used. Let's take Facebook. Now, if we have a Singaporean student who uses Facebook, yeah, so that Singaporean student becomes a digital native in Singapore using Facebook, and then they go to Australia. And then what they find is that once they do, you know, the group work, because, you know, you need to be my group, so I put you in my Facebook and all that, and then we're communicating. But what we find is that even though they are so used to using the Facebook as a platform, but the way they use it is different. So the Singaporean student will be, things like language, will be using Singlish, you know, when they communicate, right? Because they're so used to that. But then once they go to Australia, you know, Australians don't understand Singlish. So, but that is what's happening sort of like online. A few years, Singapore has Singapore Day, right, in different cities. So I brought my partner, who's Australian, to one of the Singapore days. And, it's so fun because you get a lot of food. So, being greedy, one goes. And so, Phua Chu Kang, Gurmit Singh's character, Phua Chu Kang, was actually performing at that time, because they had these performances and all that. And my poor partner was like, nudged me and went, what language is that? So I was like, no, that's English. No, that's not English. And he was like, I had to explain English for him. I literally had to translate what Phua Chu Kang was saying to him in English because he didn't quite get it. So if you take that example and use that in terms of the digital environment, the same thing goes on. So basically, what we also argue is that every international student is very different. Their digital journeys are also very different from each other. So in Australia, whenever like my research partner, his name is Shenton Chang at Melbourne Uni, whenever we do actually talk to the Department of Education and Training, and we also tell them that you need to actually understand that international students are very different from each other. Because in Australia, we want to actually, we currently have about 500,000 international students. By 2025, we want to increase that number to close to 1 million. And 1 million coming from diverse places in the world, because the Australian government has realized that we may have overtapped the Asian market, so we want to go to the Middle East and to Latin America. However, what we do, or what the government does, is that they put all the information online. Now, if your way of communicating with people is within that national context, it's going to be actually very difficult to actually communicate with people from different cultures. They may be using the same digital platforms, but they use it differently. And so what we argue is that the digital journey is something where we need to actually understand that whenever people use digital platforms, they use it where it's based on a variety of things. There are different identities, and in particular, they're different, their national identities as well. A Vietnamese student may use Facebook very differently than a Singaporean student, even though they may come from Southeast Asian countries. And Facebook, for example, is one of the fastest growing digital platforms, social media platforms in Vietnam, if not the primary one at the moment. So this is sort of like, what we were talking about. Oh, that's a very green space. This is actually meant to be my little soft sell. A lot of the things that I talked about today was actually based on the book that I just came out called Siloed Diversity. And this is something I talked about at NIE, and I explained that as the way that whenever we look at diversity, we actually need to actually question what diversity is. Where if we talk about transient migrants are interesting because I was saying earlier on, right? They may come, they may go, they may have permanent residence, and then they might go somewhere else, and then boomerang back or go elsewhere for all that we know. And so what they basically do is that whenever people go into a new country, what they do is they try to find people who are similar to them. But by similar, we are not talking about co-nationality or other traditional markers like ethnicity, but rather we're looking at the experiences that they have. And so what I argue in my book, which apparently is green at the moment, is that what we do is we find in transients people who are similar to us. So international students will find another international student who is similar to them. A foreign talent in Singapore who is maybe university educated, working in office, may find someone who is similar to them who's a co-national, but the co-national is also in that same sort of like skilled labor umbrella. So in other words, say for example, an international student from India is not going to make friends with an office worker from India. They'll make friends with international students from India. And what I've been finding, and this is one of the most interesting bits of sort of like the research I've been doing, is that when I do a comparison between Singapore and Australia, I find that people who are in Singapore, and many of them who I interviewed had been in Singapore for about a good 10 years. And so that means they had been part of, they were in schools with Singaporeans, they went to junior college, they went to universities, and they worked with Singaporeans. And Migration 101 tells us that the longer you are in a place, the more you assimilate, the more you acculturate. But what was funny is this, the longer that they were in a country, the more they actually gravitated towards the other transient migrants who were their co-nationals. In Australia, it's a different story altogether. In Australia, the international students I spoke to who were there for about 1 to 3 years, what they were doing was this. They gravitated towards other international students, but they were very open to have other international students who were not co-nationals. So they were actually quite open about this. And for me, what I found that, in that 7,000 person survey that we conducted, one of the questions I asked was, who are your friends are? Because I'm very capable. I want to know who you hang out with, because the people you hang out with are the very people who actually help express what your different identities are. And we don't have one identity, we have multiple identities. And those identities come out at different times, right? So right now your identity would be you're sitting here listening to me. In 10 minutes time, your identity changes to maybe someone who is a commuter, in a bus, or a driver, So one of the things that I asked was, and this is where, issues of those traditional markers of identity, we need to question them. So one of the questions that I asked was, are you friends with people, do you have close relationships with people in Australia who are of the same ethnic and cultural group as you? Do you want to give it a guess how many out of 6,699 people said they were friends with people who were the same ethnicity as them? So for example, an Indian international student is friends with an Indian-born Australian. Do you want to give it a guess? Close to 7,000. What's the percentage of people who are friends with Australians who are of the same ethnic group as them? Give you a guess. Sorry? A lot. So, sorry? Less than 1%. Less than 1. That was my answer, yes. 0.96% of international students were friends with Australians who were of the same ethnic group as them. So, this is where, when you are in transience, those traditional markers of identity, which we always talk about, and which governments always talk about, we need to question them, because they don't exist. Well, I won't say they don't exist anymore, but rather they don't hold as much importance as they once did, because the way that migration is now going. Does that make sense? Yeah? All right, I think maybe let's leave a bit of time for question and answer and discussion. But thank you so much for listening to me. And so sorry for this greed thing there. It was like, again, I did this in Australia. You come here, the digital journey, even with my slides, took a different complexion altogether.
All right, thank you very much.
A pleasure.
Maybe it's banned.
Yeah, it's banned.
Well, I'd like to open up the floor for any questions of clarification or comments.
I have a follow-up question.
Go for it.
The first question related to your concept
Polylingual. Here we go.
Media.
Polylingual media, yeah.
Just kind of curious, is it because of the language or because of the network of the respondents are in their own countries? My point is that is they connected because of the language or because they know the people in their own countries?
A lot of it is, I felt it was like, well, it's both actually when you think about it. So if we look at, say, let's move away from Chinese students, look at Indonesian students. Indonesian students usually used 3 platforms. Oh, okay. Line and BlackBerry, right? Line.
It was like ages ago.
Okay. This is where it's always important to refresh your data. So what are you using now? What's popular in Indonesia?
Most people use WhatsApp,
Oh yeah? What else?
Instagram.
What else?
Twitter, Facebook, yeah, really WhatsApp, but no longer BlackBerry.
Okay. Now, what are the languages that are used with all these different social media platforms that you just told us about?
I talk to my parents most of the time
Mm-hmm.
because most of my friends are all over Indonesia, and I speak in my first language Javanese.
Ah, okay.
Because I'm from Java.
Yeah.
I don't speak with my parents in Indonesia.
Okay. What else languages? Just Javanese?
With my parents, yeah. With most friends, sometimes it's English and Indonesian.
And that itself is that polymedia, polylingual. And this is where sort of like, and I think in Australia in particular, people don't quite understand that people who come from different countries actually have a wealth of, or they balance different kinds of languages. The problem in Australia is that it's a monolingual country. It treasures English language just like the way the French do, where they think that language will actually be the spine that binds people together. Because Australia is quite a diverse country. So what you've described is that whole polylingual media where you are using and for different purposes. You talk to your parents with WhatsApp in Javanese.
Yeah, but I'm sorry not to dominate this conversation. What I'm saying is that with my parents, wherever I'm speaking, or wherever, is it because of the language or because I know them? Is it because of the language itself or because of the people? That is like something that I'm sort of questioning with myself. For example, if I ended up with my parents speaking English and why speak Japanese? If my friends speak Japanese, why speak Japanese?
I'm not quite sure what the question is though.
The question is that is it the language? But I found it like a little bit confusing for me when you mentioned that polylingual. Yes, I agree switching language because you have to talk to different people. But you use different language because you know the people. The connection between you and the people, then you network. So you use the network, the language that you know.
But the networks are also quite specific to national. So in terms of, say, the Chinese will be using Chinese media like Weibo, and they'll be using that in Mandarin. So in terms of sort of like for you, which is really quite interesting, so you're using WhatsApp, say in Javanese, but then at the same time, you're also using Instagram, maybe talking to your friends, where your friends may be, whether they're in Indonesia or even here or elsewhere, in English. Yes? Do you use it that way?
Yeah, that's true. I know what it's trying, like you trying to reach out to people who understand the language, using the language that they comfortable with. Is that point?
And it's not just reaching out. It's about adapting. Yeah. So when I say adapting, it's like, and this is where anyone who travels, who is a transient migrant, or who even is moves from one physical or one national boundary to another, where languages are actually different. What basically they do is that they start accumulating different sort of like media experiences. And so what they do is, if sort of like you say you're in Singapore, and I'm assuming you've got sort of like Singaporean, or even sort of like within this room, people who speak different languages other than Javanese. So take English for example, and you are communicating with them on different kinds of platforms. It can be even WhatsApp. So what you're doing is that you're not just balancing sort of like different platforms. You're balancing using those platforms in different languages. Sometimes certain platforms may be specific to a certain language because that is what is being used in that particular country. But sometimes, that platform becomes, a platform, for want of a better word, for a variety of languages because of the people who are communicating with. Maybe, as you rightly said, because that is a language that they can communicate more freely in. Or it can be because of like you are able to switch languages. One of the things that always fascinates me about any kind of international student, especially in Australia, again, Australia very monolingual, is that they are English is sometimes their second, third, or even fourth language. But what they basically do is that they take a lot of pains in trying to actually understand and communicate in that language well. And so what they do is that they'll be also, say Swan and I, say I speak Mandarin, Swan and I will be speaking Mandarin together, yeah? Because I'm so multilingual, I'll be speaking maybe Hindi or Tamil with Lavi, and then to you I'm speaking English. So what I do is that I'm balancing all these different languages. And so I take these languages to also communicate with the same people online through social media. So Swan and I may be Facebook friends together. She and I may be also Twitter contacts with each other. And I may switch between languages as well. On Instagram and Facebook, maybe something Lavi and I use together where I'm Lavi, so like I follow Lavi, yeah, because she's so pretty, She's also very brilliant because, but and she's also my Facebook friend. So what happens is that I may speak to her in either languages, depending on sometimes even who my audience is. Because when you think about Instagram everyone sees. So I'll give you an example of the talk that Modi did last week. If you were there, and Swan and I were there together. Modi speaks Hindi very well, but for that audience, he speaks English very well, but for that audience, he did not crack an English word. He spoke in Hindi throughout. So you've got this platform where this gentleman is speaking, this leader of a leader of a country is speaking. And so what he's doing is that platform, which is that stage, you can use any language you want to, but he chose Hindi in order to communicate wherever that he needed to, because he had his own messages, that's right. So you can use actually different platforms or the same platform with multiple languages. Likewise, you can use multiple languages or am I saying the same thing? You can use multiple languages for the same platform, or you can use one language for multiple platforms. Does that make sense? You can talk to me after this. I can unpack even more.
Yeah, so I mean, just kind of following up on that, I guess. So I'm trying to think of the relationship between online and offline, because I find that interesting, and what Mila says about trying to see those together,
yeah.
Right? So in that sense, what you're describing in a way sounds like transient migrants are doing what they do offline, online as well, right?
Okay, yeah.
Would you say that, like in terms of, you talk about how they recreate their social life in
yes,
digital
yeah.
media, and in some ways we know like traditional migration narratives of how people buy the food from their home country and cook it. So but then they're also doing they're also taking on different digital media. You say, right? So they're trying to access resources from that country, like BBC was the example you gave. So and of course traditionally traditional migration studies talk about that too, right? How they try to access resources in the host country. So would you say that the digital behavior of these transient migrants is mirroring the offline behavior?
Which is interesting because I have CNN, BBC, and all that there, but the thing is that and this went for sort of like respondents both in Singapore and Australia. To them, what is foreign is literally foreign. They don't actually access Singaporean or Australian media. So, and that sort of like, in a way, mirrors even their everyday lives. Like a lot of Australian international students always say they come to Australia, they want to make Australian friends. But to them, Australian friends is white, right? They don't see multiculturalism as white. As Australian. So, if I was an Australian citizen, they don't see me as Australian because I'm not white. And then white has also a huge spectrum. So the spectrum basically is not inclusive of anyone who looks vaguely Asian, as in like whether, you're not Asian. Yeah, okay, yeah, you're Asian. Or East Asian or South Asian or African. So, within that context, if you look outside of that, you are considered white. So for them, what they do is, their everyday lives, they live in parallel societies where they still make, they're still friends with all their international students, but and they do things that Australians do, but not together. And likewise, when we come to the digital environment, it's the same as well. And the digital environment is even more interesting because they may be immersed in the country for 3 years, but they have not been using any or accessing any news in Australia or about Australia. When I interviewed people in Australia, and these are two little stories. One is at the time, it was the general election, it was the elections in Australia. And at that time, this was 2013. And the big thing that was happening was that there was this leadership spillover in the incumbent Labour Party. And the then Prime Minister was a woman called Julia Gillard. And she was being overthrown by Kevin Rudd, who she had overthrown earlier on. So very Game of Thrones, right? And I interviewed the student, and so I was asking him, oh, do you know what's going on in Australia? Oh yeah, there's some woman who is Prime Minister. He was finishing his 2nd year. So for 2 years in Australia, he only knew that there was some woman in Australia who was Prime Minister. So you dig deeper. So I asked him, oh, so tell me more, are you interested in sort of news in Australia? Oh no, only when it concerns me. Other than that, I don't care. And then he said this is not my country. And so whenever they talk about sort of to them, what they call foreign news would literally be like CNN. They don't even see sort of Australian news as foreign. They refer to Australians as the foreigners. Sometimes in that sort of the physical environment. So when when I was talking to people, and so I was asking them, oh, what do you think of Australians? They actually refer to them as foreigners without realizing that they are the foreigners. Yeah. And at the same time, what was also really interesting is that the only programs, and this was literally across the board, that they watched was a show called MasterChef, cooking show. And so when I asked why, oh, then I can learn how to cook lah. But if you look at MasterChef, it's like the kind of things you and I will never be able to cook because it will take 5 hours just to chop the ingredients in and put them into a pot. So you've got sort of these little sort of things visionettes that come out, and to me it's just really quite interesting. That sense of self-awareness was just absolutely not quite there, but yet it was interesting in that sense as well. And part of that is also, I think, and feel free to disagree with me, that part of that is also re-emphasized by their digital media life as well. So it reinforces. One of the things I found was that, especially with people who are finishing up their degree, was that they actually wanted to connect with other people who are co-nationals, but who are not living in the home country. I interviewed this Malaysian undergraduate, and so she was saying that yes, she keeps in touch with her friends back home in Malaysia, but then she feels that because she's got this overseas experience, she's different from them. So you dig more, yeah? And so she said, so I asked her, why are you different? And she said, oh, because I'm special. I have the overseas experience, and when I go back to Malaysia, when I get married, I only want to marry a man who has also had an overseas experience, because everyone else doesn't matter. How mean that sounds, and weird that sounds. That was actually the theme, a thread that ran through a lot of my respondents, where they felt that only people who have been transient migrants themselves, who have lived outside the country of their home birth, will be able to understand them. Only transient migrants will be the ones who they can relate to. Even those who actually came to Australia, Australia is quite a diverse country, and it's also quite different from say from different countries in Asia, obviously. But what they basically do is that for them, they actually also view other international students as practical friends to have. And practical friends like this. So when I ask, why are you friends with Australians? Oh, but Australians don't know how to open a bank account. Which is true, because Australian kids have their parents who have, open bank accounts for them. Australian students don't know where to find good sort of roti prata. And those things actually, you know how funny it is, those things actually matter because it's about practical. And so for many international students, the very first people that they meet in the first couple of weeks become their strong friends for the next 3 years of their undergraduate degree. You know? So universities in Australia in particular, they have wonderful orientation programs for international students. But the international students are always gated where the orientation program for 1 week does not include local kids. So what happens is, you know, how good universities have this, you know, orientation in mind, what happens is that those strong friendships are made from the very beginning. And those strong friendships actually last throughout the 3 years. You know,
I think we should take one more question before the time is out.
Right. Just want to talk about the notion of identity. So I think a little bit some of these notions we're talking about the sort of media and journey. So in my own work with foreign domestic workers, I come to realize that some of them actually have multiple reasons of harm.
yes.
In one account, they were in Tagalog, connected with their families, and then the other, they had one that's specifically for Singapore use, and specifically to show off.
Yeah.
And so they are still connected with their family, but somehow there's some secret,
like an avatar.
like basically, like the family member knows that this is an account that is to show off, and everyone just knows. For that account, there's only showing this sort of, you know, all the payouts, and then specifically they never mentioned that they were foreign domestic workers. They like call themselves overseas foreign workers, or so they create this sort of ambiguity.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they still maintain that, you know, that other, the original place of account they have, which is very difficult for them. So in that they are Filipino, and in the new people account they are family. So I just wonder, you know, is that sort of like the new way of how migrants negotiate identities? Do you see that in the
I argue that we don't have one identity, we have multiple identities, and those identities are also quite flexible. Sometimes in transient, certain identities become stronger, and certain identities are formed, and certain identities are temporary. And sometimes the temporary identities become the strongest. If you're an international student, your strongest identity is an international student, but it's also a very limited identity. You know, so you connect with people whether or not online or in the physical world because of your status as an international student. And for many of my respondents, they were very proud of that. But at the same time, I mean, I really loved what you were talking about, your work, because what you have here is that you've got performance happening, right? You've got performance of, you know, not just different identities, but also maybe different imagined identities, because it is about sort of like trying to convince, it's about face as well, right? You know, you're trying to convince certain people who matter in this particular way what you are doing and how you're doing. I mean, before social media, think of it sort of like, you know, whenever we're overseas, even we're with friends traveling, so once a week you call back mommy, right? So mommy will ask you, how are you? Oh, everything okay. Are you sleeping well? Yes. Are you eating well? Yes. But actually what you're doing is that you are going to bed at 3 o'clock in the morning and your dinner, lunch and breakfast is chocolate chip cookies. You know, so, you know, you've got this kind of like sort of like performance that's happening, but a performance where, you know, you are being very, very, I would say literal, but you actually have a certain power because that person can't actually quite see you, unless of course you have that person, or, you know, like you say, you've got different Facebook accounts. So if you are like my respondents who, you know, stalk their friends, likewise your parents are also stalking you. So what do? You have a separate account for your parents, your grandma, your grandfather, probably about 12 people there. But then your more fun account, you have 1,200 people where you will be showing off that you are sleeping at 2 o'clock in the morning and eating chocolate chip cookies morning, noon and night. So again, you know, it's a kind of like this negotiation of, you're right, this identity as a child of parents who are concerned about you, and then your identity as a 22-year-old who is just, you know, enjoying life as what a 22-year-old should be, and exploring and even experiencing and trying to figure out their own personal identity. So no, that's really quite fascinating, because you've got layers and nuances where individuals are able to enable themselves through their identities, whether or not real or imagined.
Do you see it as sort of coping strategy, or is it something new out there?
I think we all cope in some way, shape or form. You know, you are taken out of your home country your family, it's not, you're not uprooted, it's not uprooted in the sense of, forced migration or whatever, but you do it because it's not just because you want to, but because maybe you need to. And it's always very hard for any person, whether or not you are a domestic worker, whether or not you're a student, whether or not you are a skilled professional, to actually get out and move and then recreate and reimagine yourself in a completely foreign environment. Even going from Singapore to Malaysia is a completely foreign environment on so many different levels. Even coming from Indonesia to Singapore is a completely foreign environment, right? And so what you're doing is that you're right, it's a coping strategy. And so you cope in order to try to find a sense of belonging. I argue in my work that, based on my work on transient migrants, is that people actually groups create parallel societies, and parallel societies where they do acculturate. So international students in Australia will do things that they think Australians do, like go for coffee, go cafe, have barbecue, because apparently every Australian has put shrimp on the barbie. Yeah, that's what you do. And drink really bad VB beer. But then they do it with each other. They do it with Australians. So you basically have the acculturation happening because they love the lifestyle. And that's why many international students in Australia want to stay in Australia, because they really like the lifestyle. But they don't actually integrate or assimilate. They want to. One of the we have a kind of like exit survey for international students every year. It's called the International Student Barometer. And we always ask the usual questions of, did you like what you studied, blah, blah, blah. What are your regrets? And the main regret over and over again is, I don't have Australian friends. And again, that is also a complexity by itself, because like I said, to them, for 3 years living there, they still think that Australian is white. Sorry?
Why do you think they need Australian friends?
Why do you think they don't need Australian friends? Do you have Singaporean? Okay, you're from Indonesia. Do you have Singaporean friends?
I'm friends with almost everybody.
Why are you friends with everyone?
Because they want to be friends with me.
Do you feel that you need to be friends with Singaporeans?
I'm friends with almost everybody.
No. No, but do you feel that you need to, okay, let me make it broader. Do you think you feel that you need to make friends when you are in Singapore?
I make friends with most people who are in Singapore and not there.
No, you not answered my question. I said, this is me getting back at you.
Are you a person who that?
Sorry?
I'm kidding.
Do you feel that you need to make friends when you are in Singapore? Do you need to?
Do you need to make friends or join friends?
No, do you need to?
Do I make friends or have friends?
Do you need to make friends in Singapore as a foreigner?
Not really. Not only in Singapore, wherever I travel, I really need to make friends.
Maybe the big difference. Sorry?
We're passing each other.
But I think,
Okay,
sorry? Oh, did you want to? Yeah. I think for you, you've had many sort of like overseas experiences. I think for a lot of international students where 95% of them, it's the first time they've ever left home. And when you leave home, you're 21, you're 19. You feel you're coming to a country which seems totally alien. But at the same time, you feel that in order to come to a new country, you also want to make friends with people who are different from you. And there's a certain kind of sort of like idea that if you're in Australia, having a white friend gives you a certain sort of like social and cultural currency. In a way, it is. Huh?
Well, just interjecting a bit. So you mentioned in your data that 95% is literally from home country to Australia.
Yep.
So, in a way, it's sort of 5% people who have had prior transnational experiences to come to Australia. Are there digital realities different from the people who, the normal travelers, say? Do they have different sort of digital strategies for coping? Are their network systems different? Are there strategies towards acclimatization different?
Interesting enough, that 5% basically still reconnected to whoever the home country was. I interviewed a young lady from China, originally from China, but she was actually Kiwi. So at the age of 10, she migrated to New Zealand. But living in Australia, studying in Australia, she actually wanted to reconnect with anything and anyone Chinese, because she felt that she was uprooted from her country for, too young. So for her, Australia was a chance to actually reconnect with her Chinese identity. So for her, she was actually going on to things like Weibo to reconnect. And when I interviewed foreign talent students, in particular students from China and Singapore, and that time, many of them had been in Singapore for like 8 years, 5 years, where the social media in China did not take off when they were younger. So for them to reconnect with China, they were actually in Singapore they were connecting with Chinese social media in order to understand what was going on in their home country. So there is this boomerang of, we want to understand what goes on in the home country, and we use the social media platforms which are foreign to us. So it wasn't about transferring, but rather connecting brand new.
Well, we can go on, but it's after time. So I was hoping that we can close now, and Kat is available for informal conversations afterwards, right? For 5-10 minutes.
Yeah, because I have to go to NIE for a meeting at 4.
Okay,
It's been very busy.
Thank you for a presentation.
Thank you.